A little bit of a warning on this video. There'll be a mention of a part of the male anatomy. So I got an interesting request from a urologist here in town. When he came to me, he was just about to graduate as a newly minted urologist. And he was working on a side project to make what would normally be some sort of object like a plaque that's given out at graduation to the new graduates and visiting professors. And his idea was to make brass testicles. And what he needed was a wooden base to hold the two pieces of brass in place and a place to put a plaque for the name of the person receiving the object. So he came to me to make the wooden base, and I thought this was a interesting project. So I started thinking about how to make the cutout for a form that isn't really something you can measure very easily. And what I ended up doing was photographing the pieces of brass with a longish lens, so they're fairly flat. And I drew in Illustrator what I was going to need to cut. And the idea I had was to make a stepped cutout so that I wouldn't try and make the actual negative of the three-dimensional form of the brass. I would make the outline, then make a secondary step to kind of take some of the deeper bits on the brass. Because the base just had to hold the brass in place. It didn't have to actually fit the three-dimensional form perfectly. When he had made the brass pieces, he modeled them in clay just by hand and just by eye. So they weren't based on a 3D model in the computer that I could use for the form. So I did some test cuts, and I got it pretty close. And then we decided they should stand up. They shouldn't lie flat on a piece of wood. That didn't seem very interesting. So I took another photo, sort of the bottom of the pieces of brass, and I drew the cutout that I needed to make. The major outline wasn't too hard, but it was sort of harder to guess at what the secondary step was going to be. But that also didn't matter quite so much because you don't see how the brass and that secondary hole fit together. They just have to sit in there and stand up. So I made some scrap pieces of wood to use as tests. And I did lots of tests. And I got it fairly close. It took a lot of fiddling with the edge of the cutout to get it to fit with the brass and look like they went together. So I would cut one and then fit it and then see where I needed to move the lines around, and I'd move the lines a little bit, and I did that over and over again and got it pretty close. We decided to do the final pieces in walnut. We thought the brass and the walnut would go together well. So we got a big, thick piece of walnut. There'll be a plaque on the front face of the wood, so we needed some height to the base, which is why it's so thick. So I joined it and planed and got it nice and flat. Now on this piece of wood, there was one end where most of the bend in the piece of wood was, so I cut that off to do the first batch. For this graduating class, I think we needed 3 for graduates and then 1 as a gift to a visiting professor. So I cut out the holes in the piece of wood as one big piece, so I could do all the cutouts at once. And I could sand those and kind of clean up the holes. Once the cutouts were made, I could then cut the piece into its individual bases. So I ripped the length, and then I could cut each piece out of each strip. Then a little bit of sanding, and some final sanding with a hand sander. Now there was going to be a plaque on the front vertical face. So before I put the finish on, I needed to put a piece of masking tape on the front, just so there wouldn't be any finish there. So the sticky on the plaque would stick to the wood, because it wouldn't stick to the finish very well. So I just used an oil finish. And this is what the first batch looked like. And you can see the plaque. And they turned out pretty well. Those were given out at graduation, and from what I've heard, they went over really well. Now for the second batch, I can use the rest of the piece of walnut. And these will sort of be for future years. So they'll get put in a box somewhere and saved for the future. So I did the same technique where I did the cutouts on the full piece of wood before I cut it apart. I think for these I did it in sets of 4, and then I re-zeroed my router and then did the next set. Or sets of 8, I guess, four pairs. And this end piece had a big crack in it, so I cut that off. I started to rip this piece in half, and there was a lot of stress in it, and the table saw just wasn't going to do it. So I put it on the bandsaw and ripped it that way, and this worked much, much better. In fact, I should have done this to begin with. Then I could cut each piece out of each strip. And I cut them down into smaller sets, and then from there I could cut each piece out. Then once I had all the pieces cut, I could start working on each block. I could sand again. Now a few of these, I think 4, because the wood was close to the outside of the tree, there was sort of a missing section. So I glued some scrap pieces of walnut to those corners and taped them in place just to hold them while the glue sets up. Once the glue's set up, I can take the tape off. Now my thought was to then just sand off the extra bit of the piece of scrap wood that I glued on. And this actually worked really well. And I got a complete shape. And I could sand all of them. Mostly this was sanding the ends. The sides were in pretty good shape after the disc sander. I did a little bit of hand sanding on the corners. Then some finish, doing all the masking tape for the plaques. Now I used a Q-tip to get into the hole on these, but I think a small brush would have worked better. The Q-tip kept falling apart and fraying. So once those are set, I can take the tape off and put them in a box, and the project's done. And these will sit until they're used, and maybe in 5 or 6 years, they'll get back to me about making more. Thanks for watching.